The Gravekeeper's Secret. Unveiling the haunting truth beneath the cemetery. A supernatural thriller story. Emma Hayes rolled down the window of her dusty old sedan, letting the cool air of Hollow Creek wash over her. It was her first day in this remote town, a stark contrast to the bustling city she had left behind. She had come here to escape her past and find solace in a quieter life. The house she had rented was a quaint two-story structure on the edge of town, surrounded by sprawling fields and thick forests. As she drove through the town, she couldn't help but notice the eerie charm of Hollow Creek. The streets were lined with vintage shops, and the buildings seemed frozen in time. The centerpiece of the town was the old cemetery, perched on a hill overlooking the community. It was both haunting and beautiful, with its ancient stone tombstones and overgrown pathways. Emma parked her car and decided to explore the cemetery. She had always been fascinated by history and the stories that old graveyards could tell. As she walked among the gravestones, she noticed an elderly man in tattered clothes meticulously tending to the grounds. His presence was as much a part of the cemetery as the stones themselves. This was Elias Thorne, the town's enigmatic gravekeeper. Elias looked up from his work and gave her a curt nod. His face was weathered and his eyes seemed to hold a depth of secrets. Emma introduced herself and asked about the history of the cemetery. Elias's response was terse and evasive. "It's not a place for curiosity," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "Best leave it be." Emma was taken aback by his coldness but couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the cemetery than met the eye. As she walked back to her car, she couldn't ignore the chill that settled in the air, nor the sense of being watched. Over the next few days, Emma settled into her new home and began exploring Hollow Creek. Her curiosity about the cemetery grew, and she found herself drawn back to its secluded corners. One afternoon, as she wandered deeper into the graveyard, she stumbled upon several graves that were strangely unmarked. They had no names, no dates, just crude, weathered stones. Her heart raced as she examined the graves, noting the stark difference between these and the others that were well maintained. She found a small, weather-beaten journal buried near one of the graves. The journal was filled with disturbing entries about people disappearing from Hollow Creek over the years, the last entry dated just a month before. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew she had to find out more about these mysterious unmarked graves. She returned to town and visited the local library, hoping to uncover some historical records. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret Bell, seemed wary when Emma asked about the cemetery. "Not many people come looking for old secrets," Margaret said, her eyes narrowing. "Some things are best left undisturbed." Despite the warning, Emma pressed on. She discovered records of disappearances dating back decades, each linked to the cemetery in some way. The more she read, the more uneasy she became. It seemed that the cemetery held a dark and sinister past that the townsfolk were eager to forget. Emma decided to confront Elias Thorne about the unmarked graves. She returned to the cemetery, where Elias was again working among the stones. She approached him, her resolve firm despite the growing sense of dread. "Mr. Thorne, I found some graves that don't seem to be on your records," Emma began. "Can you tell me about them?" Elias's expression darkened. "I told you before, some things are better left alone. This cemetery has its secrets, and it's not for outsiders to meddle with." Emma's curiosity was now tinged with fear, but she knew she couldn't turn back. There was something deeply troubling about the graves and the dark warnings she had received. As she left the cemetery, the air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows lengthened, making her feel like she was not alone. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma returned to the cemetery the following day. The air was thick with tension, and the once charming graveyard now seemed foreboding and oppressive. As she approached Elias Thorne, who was again working with an air of grim determination, she could see that he was avoiding eye contact. "Mr. Thorne, I need to know more about these unmarked graves," Emma pressed. "There's something wrong here and I can't just ignore it." Elias stopped his work and looked at her with a mixture of frustration and fear. "You're meddling in things you don't understand," he said. "I've kept this place for decades, and there are reasons certain things are left unsaid. Some histories are better left buried." Emma's resolve only strengthened in the face of his warning. "I can't just walk away from this. People deserve to know the truth." Elias's face hardened. "You've been warned. The cemetery holds many secrets, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered. If you're set on digging deeper, be prepared for what you might find." The gravekeeper's ominous words weighed heavily on Emma as she left the cemetery. She knew she couldn't abandon her quest for answers, but Elias's warning had ignited a deep sense of unease. That night, Emma found herself unable to sleep. The eerie warnings and the unsettling discoveries from the cemetery haunted her thoughts. Unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, she decided to return to the graveyard under the cover of darkness. Armed with a flashlight and a notebook, Emma crept through the cemetery's overgrown paths. The moonlight cast long, menacing shadows across the tombstones, and the night air was filled with a chilling silence. As she approached the unmarked graves, she felt a sudden drop in temperature, causing her breath to fog in front of her. Suddenly, Emma heard faint whispers drifting through the air. They were indistinct at first, like the rustling of leaves, but soon coalesced into a haunting chorus of voices. The whispers seemed to come from the graves themselves, growing louder and more insistent. Emma's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the cemetery. She saw fleeting glimpses of shadows moving among the tombstones, but whenever she turned to face them directly, there was nothing there. Her heart pounded in her chest as the whispers grew more urgent, filling the night with an otherworldly sense of dread. In a panic, Emma decided to leave. As she hurried back to the cemetery gate, she heard a sudden rustling behind her. She turned around and caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure disappearing among the gravestones. The figure's presence was accompanied by a cold, oppressive aura that left Emma feeling utterly terrified. Emma barely managed to make it back to her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. She sped away from the cemetery, her mind racing with questions and fear. The shadows and whispers had left an indelible mark on her psyche, and she knew that the cemetery held secrets that were far darker than she had imagined. The next morning, Emma felt a profound sense of dread lingering from her nocturnal experience. Determined to dig deeper, she decided to visit Margaret Bell, the town historian, who might hold the key to understanding the cemetery's dark past. Margaret's home was a small, cluttered house filled with old books and documents. The historian herself was a stern yet kind-hearted woman who seemed to know more about the town's history than she let on. When Emma arrived, Margaret greeted her with a cautious smile. "I'm glad you're here, Emma. I've been expecting you," she said, ushering Emma inside. After a brief chat, Emma broached the subject of the cemetery. "Margaret, I've discovered some disturbing things about the unmarked graves and the disappearances. Can you help me understand what's going on?" Margaret's face grew serious. She led Emma to a room filled with dusty old records and began to sift through them. "Hollow Creek has always had its secrets," Margaret began. "But what you're uncovering is tied to a dark chapter in our town's history." She opened a weathered ledger, revealing pages of records about Hollow Creek's past. Many years ago, there were rumors of occult practices and mysterious disappearances. Some believed it was the work of a malevolent force, while others thought it was a curse. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. The town's founders were said to have made a pact to protect their land from evil. They created a ritual to keep malevolent spirits at bay. But something went wrong. Emma listened intently, her heart racing. "And what about Elias Thorne? How does he fit into this?" Margaret's eyes clouded with unease. Elias Thorne was the last in a long line of gravekeepers. His family was responsible for maintaining the cemetery and ensuring the town's pact was upheld. It's said that his wife, Lydia, was deeply involved in the rituals, but her death was shrouded in mystery. Emma's curiosity was now matched by a growing sense of dread. What happened to Lydia Thorne? Margaret hesitated before answering. Her death was officially ruled an accident, but many believe there was more to it. Elias was left to guard the cemetery alone, and the dark history of Hollow Creek became something people preferred to forget. Emma left Margaret's house feeling more unsettled than ever. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the bigger picture was still obscured by darkness and fear. She knew she had to learn more, not just about Elias, but about the curse that seemed to haunt the town. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma joined forces with Detective Marcus Reed, who had recently arrived in town to investigate the strange disappearances linked to the cemetery. Marcus was a seasoned investigator with a skeptical attitude towards supernatural claims, but the recent developments had made him uneasy. They met at Emma's home to discuss their findings. "I've been looking into the disappearances," Marcus said. "The patterns are unsettling. All the missing persons had some connection to the cemetery. It's almost as if they vanished without a trace." Emma nodded. "I've discovered some disturbing things about the graveyard's history. Margaret Bell mentioned a pact and a ritual gone wrong. Elias Thorne's wife Lydia seems to be central to it all." Marcus frowned. "I've heard whispers about Lydia Thorne. People say she was involved in some occult practices, but the official records are sparse. Elias has always been a recluse. He never talks about his past." The two of them decided to confront Elias Thorne together. They arrived at the cemetery as dusk fell, the atmosphere thick with tension. Elias was working near Lydia's grave, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Thorne," Marcus began, "we've been investigating the recent disappearances and the history of this cemetery. We need to know the truth about Lydia Thorne and the curse." Elias's face darkened. "Some things are better left buried," he said. "You're meddling in forces you don't understand. The truth about Lydia and the cemetery is more than you can handle." Emma and Marcus pressed for answers, but Elias remained resolute. His warning echoed in their minds as they left the cemetery, their apprehension growing. The deeper they delved, the more dangerous their quest for truth became. Determined to unravel the mystery, Emma and Marcus continued their investigation into the eerie happenings in Hollow Creek. Their inquiries had drawn them closer to the heart of the mystery, but each step seemed to deepen the darkness surrounding them. One night, they decided to stake out the cemetery, hoping to catch a glimpse of the shadowy figure Emma had seen during her earlier visit. They hid in the shadows near the cemetery gates, their flashlights off, and waited in silence. The night was unusually still, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. As the hours passed, Emma and Marcus grew increasingly uneasy. Suddenly, a faint movement caught Emma's eye, a dark shape flitting between the gravestones. The shadowy figure was tall and indistinct, its features obscured by the darkness. Emma's heart raced as she nudged Marcus. "There," she whispered, pointing towards the figure. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he scanned the area. "Stay quiet and follow my lead," he instructed. They cautiously moved closer, their footsteps barely making a sound on the overgrown grass. The shadowy figure seemed to be drawn to the center of the cemetery, where the old, weathered mausoleum stood. Emma and Marcus followed, careful to keep out of sight. As they approached the mausoleum, the figure stopped and seemed to disappear into the shadows. Emma and Marcus exchanged nervous glances and approached the mausoleum's entrance. The heavy stone door was slightly ajar, and they could see a dim light flickering inside. With a deep breath, Marcus pushed the door open and stepped inside. The mausoleum was cold and musty, filled with old caskets and cobwebs. In the flickering light of their flashlights, they saw a series of strange symbols etched into the walls. Symbols that matched those described in Margaret Bell's records. Suddenly they heard a low, guttural growl echoing through the mausoleum. The shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form becoming more defined, a ghastly, spectral presence with hollow eyes and a menacing aura. Emma and Marcus stumbled back, their faces pale with terror. The figure advanced towards them, its form shifting and undulating as if it were made of smoke. The air grew icy, and the whispers from before intensified into a deafening cacophony. Desperate to escape, Emma and Marcus fled from the mausoleum, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They bolted through the cemetery, the chilling presence of the shadowed figure pursuing them. As they reached the cemetery gates, they glanced back to see the figure vanish into the darkness. Shaken but determined, Emma and Marcus knew that they had to confront Elias Thorne one final time to get the answers they desperately needed. The next morning, Emma and Marcus were exhausted but resolute. They returned to Elias Thorne's house, ready to confront him with their findings and demand the truth. Elias was tending to the cemetery, his expression grim as he saw them approach. "We've seen it," Emma said firmly. "The shadowy figure. The symbols in the mausoleum. We need to know what's really going on here." Elias's face was a mask of sorrow and resignation. "You've seen the consequences of digging too deep," he said quietly. "The curse that plagues Hollow Creek is tied to the ancient pact my ancestors made. It was meant to protect the town, but something went terribly wrong." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Lydia and I were involved in a ritual to bind a malevolent spirit that had been awakened. But the ritual failed, and the spirit was bound to the cemetery. My family has guarded this place to prevent it from escaping." Emma and Marcus listened in stunned silence as Elias revealed the full extent of the curse. Lydia's death was a result of the spirit's rage. She was sacrificed to prevent it from breaking free, but the curse lingers. The shadowed figure you saw is the spirit, manifesting its anger and desire for freedom. Elias's eyes were filled with regret. "I've spent my life trying to contain the spirit, but I'm old and my strength is fading. The spirit is growing more powerful, and soon it will break free." Emma and Marcus knew they had to act quickly. "Is there any way to break the curse?" Marcus asked urgently. Elias nodded slowly. "There is one final ritual that might restore the balance, but it requires courage and sacrifice. You must confront the spirit and perform the ritual at the heart of the cemetery. It's a dangerous task, but it's the only way to save Hollow Creek." With a sense of determination and dread, Emma and Marcus prepared for the final confrontation. They returned to the cemetery, the air thick with anticipation and fear. As they reached the center, where the old ritual symbols were etched into the ground, they saw the shadowed figure materialize before them. Emma and Marcus performed the ritual as instructed, their voices trembling as they chanted the ancient incantations. The spirit's anger reached a crescendo, but as the final words were spoken, a blinding light enveloped the cemetery. When the light faded, the shadowed figure was gone, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The curse had been broken, and the cemetery was finally at peace. Emma and Marcus stood in silence, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had experienced. Elias Thorne thanked them before departing, his duty fulfilled and his burden lifted. Hollow Creek began to heal, and its dark past was laid to rest. Emma and Marcus returned to their lives, forever changed by the secrets they had uncovered. The graveyard remained a silent witness to the events that had transpired, a testament to the power of truth and the resilience of those who dared to confront the darkness. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Explore our playlist of supernatural thrillers for more eerie and captivating stories. See you in the next tale.